Throughout history, there have always been two age divisions, children and adults. But in the more recent years, our society has developed a third age division, adolescence. They identify this as a transitioning stage, but in reality it is a crutch. It is a way of explaining the erratic and rebellious actions of the teenagers in our time. This idea is a complete myth, and it needs to be exposed. Adolescence is defined by society as the period of time between no longer being a child and yet still not an adult. Typically from the time when puberty begins, usually at about the age of 11 to 13, depending on the gender, until the age of 18 to 25. It was completely inexistent up until the 18th century, when the influential French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau properly identified it. He disagreed with the then prevalent idea of treating children as mini adults. He thought that they should be free of responsibility and able to fully enjoy their childhood. How, though, is adolescence a myth? All throughout history, adolescents have been viewed as adults. Let me explain this by talking about some of the accomplishments, the responsibilities, and the marriages of these adolescents. Joseph from the Bible was only age 17, but God still greatly used him to preserve the nation of Israel. David was only a youth when he became king. The Hebrew word used to describe him is nar, which means that he was weaned yet not marriable. And the Hebrew age for marriage was 12 years old. And Jesus Christ himself was a very influential man, teaching in the courts in Luke 2 when he was only 12 years old. Obviously, this is a unique example because he was fully God, but at the same time, God wouldn't have used him as an adolescent. If he believed in adolescence, he would have waited until Jesus had fully enjoyed his childhood. Also, adolescents had many responsibilities placed on them in past times. The Egyptian king Tut was only 8 to 9 when he became pharaoh, and Spartans were trained for war when they were only 7 years old. All throughout history, young people were treated like adults and expected to act like them. Adolescents were also married at much younger ages in the past. The Hebrews were married at age 12, as I already mentioned, and the Romans would marry between the ages of 12 and 14. In America and England, the laws are also quite similar, although now it's 18 in America and 16 in England. Even Shakespeare's romantic Romeo and Juliet were only 13 years old. Adolescents now have little to no responsibilities, though. People generally have extremely low expectations of them, and therefore they accomplish little. Interestingly enough, though, puberty was at a much later time than it is now. In the past, it would occur at about 6 years later than it does now. The ironic twist of this is that people nowadays spend several years unmarried after passing puberty, but in the past, people would spend several years married before passing puberty. Adolescents were defined earlier as being in a transitional stage, where they're not yet an adult, but they're also no longer a child. What we can see quickly, though, is that for all intents and purposes, they're still children. They have no responsibilities, they accomplish little, and overall they still act like children. These low expectations that are placed on them cause things like drugs, premarital sex, drinking, smoking, to all become prevalent in a teen's life. Unsafe sex often results in pregnancy and then abortion. More than this, though, it is completely unbiblical. 1 Corinthians 7:2 says, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, which is premarital sex, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband." What the author is saying here is that those who are tempted by sexual immorality must, in order to avoid it, find a woman or a husband and marry them. In our society, sexual immorality runs rampant because so many people are prolonging this adolescence and prolonging their childhood so they don't become married. And when they do become married, they aren't ready for it. They also have more access to drugs, particularly marijuana. A recent national survey that was done said that 1 out of every 10 teens did marijuana up to 20 times last month. And the amount of times that they do marijuana and the amount of marijuana that is being consumed by adolescents greatly increases their chances of using other drugs such as ecstasy, cocaine, over-the-counter drugs, which means that they can become addicted to them much more quickly. Drug use is most prevalent in those who are aged 18 to 25, according to a recent survey done by the U.S. government, and this falls directly into the adolescent age group. Adolescents are supposed to be preparing for adulthood, which often also means marriage, which means responsibility. But how is not placing responsibilities on them and not having any expectations of them preparing them at all for this time of marriage? Sadly, what we see is that it doesn't prepare them for this time of marriage. Men are increasingly moving out of the position of being the breadwinner in a family, and women are having to step in to fill this role. In the United States, 65% of women who are married under the age of 24 have marriages that end in divorce, and 50% of men's marriages in this same age group also end in divorce. How do we fix this, though? We have to begin by targeting the younger generations. We do this by requiring more out of them. We need to focus on the current parents and, most importantly, on the new or future parents who will be raising up the next generation of adolescents. We need to be placing responsibilities on them. For both men and women, the idea of having responsibilities must be instilled at a young age. Even with chores, taking out the trash, washing the car, cleaning your room, simple things like this can really help to prepare your teen for adulthood. There is a distinction between responsibilities and being responsible, though, but they do go hand in hand. Responsibilities could be termed as the means, and being responsible would be the action. Responsibilities are essential for one to be responsible. If one is responsible and also accepting of responsibilities, then great things can be accomplished by this individual. We also have to have higher expectations of our teens. J.K. Rowling, a British author, said in one of the many books that she wrote, "You see what you expect to see." If we had higher expectations, our so-called adolescents might try to actually meet these expectations. With raised expectations, while still acknowledging that these might not always be lived up to, the spontaneity and compulsiveness of teens with regards to drugs and sex will lessen because they will have a restraint placed on them. We have to set an example for our teens also. Titus 2 says that older men are to be sober-minded, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness, and to urge the younger men to be self-controlled. And with regards to the women, the author says that older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine, and to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, and submissive to their own husbands. If we could only live like this and give these young adults a godly example to live by, the divorce rate would rapidly decrease, as wives submitted to their husbands and husbands were self-controlled and sober-minded, and began to be responsible and care for their families. History has proven to us that this idea of a transitioning stage in life is consistently and quickly spiraling downhill. As time has progressed, a paradox of teens behaving rebelliously and adults consistently lowering their expectations has become prevalent. These two things are constantly playing off of each other. There will be no hope in sight unless we begin to address these problems and begin to raise up a new generation of teens that are responsible and prepared for life.